Okay, I thought this was so funny. I was laughing so hard I was crying in my office the other day, and I think Cameron was a little concerned, my office mate. This has nothing really to do with what I'm talking about today. I just thought I'd try to make you laugh at first, and sort of worked. I don't know. Okay, I am talking about animals and humor today, so thank you, Helmut, for the lovely introduction. Thank you also to Christoph and everyone at the RCC for your support and help. You are all fantastic. Ranger Jenny is a hard act to follow, but she inspired me to wear something of a costume. You can see I'm trying to do the animal print thing today. And hopefully I'll make you, as I said, laugh a little bit. Not as much as she did, but. Okay, so my talk today is called Boys Gone Wild, Documenting Bad Natures. There's a slight change in the original spelling of the title. I'll explain that a little later on. I'm talking today about a television program called Wild Boys that was aired on MTV between 2003 and 2006. I should say American MTV and MTV2. It was a spin-off of Jackass. Has anyone heard of Jackass? Oh, good. Okay, cool. I thought I was going to have to explain it, and I couldn't think of how to explain it in a non-obscene way. So this was a follow-up to the program Jackass, starring two of the people that were originally on the program. On the left is Steve-O, that's what he goes by. On the right is Chris Pontius. And I forget what's happening in this episode. I think he's dressed as a little Bo Peep on the right, and Steve-O's dressed as a sheep. The program is a mix of, we could say, 3 different genres at least. The first is what researchers have called extreme stunt reality television. So if you've ever seen a Japanese game show, for instance, where people, like giant balls are like chasing you down a hill or something. So a mixture of that kind of genre, mixture of travel programs, and nature wildlife programming is probably the most obvious touchstone. So Wipeout plus Rick Steves plus Crocodile Hunter equals Wild Boys. Oh, and I should just quickly explain what happens. In a typical episode, the boys will travel to a quote-unquote exotic destination, India, Thailand, Florida, New Orleans, and they'll do basically 3 different categories of things. The first is that they'll encounter native species, so animals, insects, flora, fauna. The second is that they'll explore the landscape, especially unusual features like a volcano or something like that. And the third is that they'll participate in local rituals. So they pierce their faces when they're in India. They drink blood of a cow or something like that. So they try to get in with the locals in a rather irreverent way. But the animals are the real focus. That's what I'll focus on today. And they do stunts with the animals, like the stunt you are about to see from the Florida episode of 2004.
Southern Florida is known for stone crabs, and the season's finally arrived. So we're here to make sure that these little guys are healthy. And we're going to perform some important...
God damn, I hate stone crab season.
Because the research that we're doing is very important.
The research we're doing is messed up.
What we're trying to do is replace fear and ignorance with respect and understanding. Come on, replace my fear and ignorance with respect and understanding.
Okay. Don't judge my iTunes choices, sorry. Some of them are respectable. Okay, so as I wrote in my notes here, feel free to laugh if you thought that was funny. Hopefully you did. Okay, I'm going to come back to Wild Boys in just a moment, but first I wanted to put my interest in the program in the context of the research that I'm doing here at the RCC, which Helmut was alluding to. I'm working on a project that I'm calling Bad Environmentalism, Affective Descent in the Ecological Age. It has a couple different objectives. The first is to identify and interpret a trend in Western cultural thought that I call bad environmentalism. It draws, the book is also going to try to draw attention to environmentally oriented texts that defy mainstream environmentalism's characteristic 4 S's. Sincerity, sentimentality, seriousness, sanctimony. And if you have any others that you want to add later, let me know. If they start with an S, then that's good. Instead, the texts revel in bad affects and sensibilities, playfulness, irreverence, ignorance, perversity, repulsiveness. I think the Wild Boys have most of that list. Oops. Would I like to do something? I don't know. Close it. Okay. Thank you. The archive I'm using is a contemporary one, so I'm looking at a lot of different genres. As Helmut was saying, kind of trying to do a really interdisciplinary and really intergeneric project. So I'm looking at fiction film and documentary film, comedy television and reality television, performance art, drama, poetry, and prose fiction. These texts are almost all from the United States, and maybe in Q&A I can talk a little bit more about what I think, how I think that bad environmentalism is sometimes a uniquely American response, or what's uniquely American about this phenomenon. But I will consider a couple examples from places like Australia, Canada, Germany, and the UK. So for example, the chapter I'm working on that talks about Wild Boys is going to pair Wild Boys with Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man. I don't know if people have seen that documentary, but Herzog is, of course, a German director. Okay, the arguments so far. I'm going to argue that these bad environmentalisms point to a demographic sensitive to ecological crisis, but disillusioned with mainstream environmentalist rhetoric and art. The other part of the argument is that these texts model environmental affects and sensibilities that grow out of and are particularly suited to our current moment. So I'm claiming that these are responses to something that's been going on basically over the past 2 decades. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of what I think that current moment looks like. The first example, Frederick Buell, the eco-critic, has made a claim recently that environmental crisis has, for many people, become a routine part of everyday life. So we think of crisis as something that's pressing, that's emergent, and yet somehow it's something that's become sublimated and domesticated, especially in the US. There's a fantastic book by a sociologist, Kari, I'm not sure how you say her name, Norgard. It's called Living in Denial, and she does a study of a Norwegian town where everyone knows climate change has been affecting them, right? So the snow looks different year after year, and yet no one's doing anything, no one's really talking about it. And she says this is unusual because Europe is, everyone believes in climate change in Europe, but not in the United States. So how could this be going on? And she draws on some really interesting research. So this one study finds that in sharp contrast with the knowledge deficit hypothesis, the knowledge deficit hypothesis is this idea that people just don't know enough about environmental problems. If we understood climate change, if we just knew what was going on, then we might act, we might do something. So in contrast to that hypothesis, respondents with higher levels of information about global warming show less concern. And Norgard's book, I think, does a really good job of explaining it's not that people aren't actually concerned, it's that there's various emotional and psychological barriers to acting or to being proactive. Okay. And Norgard also pulls on the work of Robert Lifton, who is a historical psychologist. He talks about this idea of, I guess he calls it the absurdity of the double life. So all of us who live in the nuclear age know that our lives can end at any moment, yet we live as though we do not know this. So again, he calls this condition the absurdity of the double life. I think we could probably replace the nuclear age with the climate change age, So it's not that we think we're going to die tomorrow, but we know that our lives are going to change. We've actually already seen our lives change. Summers look different to a lot of us than they did in the past. Yet we sublimate this knowledge. We continue on as if it doesn't exist. Okay, so all of these different things I just talked about, the idea that crisis becomes routine, the more you know, the less you care. These are deeply ironic and deeply absurd conditions. And so I'm claiming that the texts in my archive are registering those absurdities and ironies. They're responding to them, they're reminding us of them. Okay, back to Wild Boys. As I mentioned before, we can see the program as kind of a hybrid text, a mix of different genres. Very few people write about this. I think there's really only one other person. I'm going to give a plug to her essay. Cynthia Chris, she has a book, I know Seth knows this book, called Watching Wildlife. It's about wildlife and nature programming. And everyone else that writes about Wild Boys, it's one or two sentences in an article about Jackass, for instance. There's a ton of research on Jackass for whatever reason. And unbeknownst to me, Chris just came out with a book chapter called Boys Gone Wild. Darn it. So she stole my title. Actually, I stole her title unwittingly. And that's why a little different spelling here, just to not be twins. Great minds think alike. What can I say? Okay, so sure. That was a good transition. Thank you. Okay, so I actually want to look beyond or in a different way at this concept of the nature wildlife genre. I want to ask, what does Wild Boys mean in terms of the environmentalist values implicit in that genre? So in other words, I kind of want to go beyond the generic confines and ask, I'm less interested in what the show is as a genre than what it says about certain structures of feeling and thinking. Specifically, I want to argue that the Wild Boys' impulse toward parody, irreverence, and so on critiques environmentalist rhetoric more broadly, its authority, and its affect. I'm going to do this in a very strange way, which is to talk about skateboarding. Wild Boys emerges from skateboarding culture, which is known for its anti-authoritarian ethos and outsider stance. So if anyone's seen, since you all have seen Jackass, skateboarding is a big part of the show. The guy, Jeff Tremaine, who directed all of the Jackass episodes, also directed all of the Wild Boys episodes and the Jackass films. He used to run a skateboarding magazine called Big Brother. Chris Pontius, who's one of the Wild Boys, used to work for the magazine. Steve-O's an amateur skateboarder. You also have skateboarding guest stars on Wild Boys. Tony Hawk shows up at one point. And the boys incorporate skateboarding into some of their interactions with animals and nature. So they build, at one point, a skateboarding ramp that's right above a pile of elephant dung. And so they have to catch enough air to not fall into the elephant dung, which they fail to do. And yes, okay. So I also want to draw on someone I think some of you know, Annie Coleman. She's an environmental historian, and she has done some work on Jackass and reading it alongside skateboarding and snowboarding culture. She gives you a little background on the history of skateboarding. She talks about how in the 1970s, young men rode their skateboards on city sidewalks, in empty swimming pools, and public gathering spaces. Skateboarders subverted utilitarian urban and suburban landscapes by using them for sport. Okay, so I think I'm going to make sense of the skateboarding thing, I hope, by saying that just as skateboarders refuse the idea that there's only one way to approach urban and suburban space, so they're refusing those utilitarian uses, the Wild Boys refuse the idea that there's one way to approach wild space, or one way to inhabit wild space. And I'm going to link this to Wallace Himes' claim that there's a certain conformity in how one is supposed to do nature-human relations. So whether we like it or not, the Wild Boys they have this anti-conformist attitude that extends from the way you use urban and suburban spaces to the way that you use or act in wild spaces. I also want to talk about the the class dimensions of the show, because I think that's an important element when we're thinking about their kind of anti-authoritarian stance here towards environmentalist rhetoric. So the Wild Boys position themselves as outside of the nature, wildlife, environmentalist mainstream, not just by virtue of their ties to alternative and youth cultures, skateboarding, but by virtue of their class position. So at one point, Chris Pontius introduces the show as if it were a monster truck rally. Do you know what a monster truck rally is? Yes, yes, looks like that. A monster truck comes and crushes things like other small trucks, non-monster trucks. This is a stereotypically lower class American, maybe Southern, some might say white trash, quote unquote, kind of pastime. You can see, I crush cars in the name of America. Nice flag here. So I think it's the beginning of one episode, and he says, "Come on down to the Wild Boys Rage-a-rama. We got monster trucks, we got bikini car wash, we have a wet t-shirt contest," something like that. So he's, this is a performance, right? But he's linking, the program is linking itself to certain forms of lower class, lower status entertainment. There's also an episode where the Wild Boys are about to play polo in India, and they look at each other and say, "We haven't played polo since we met as undergrads at Yale." And they don't even say it in a funny voice, but you're supposed to know they didn't go to Yale, right? They didn't even go to college, unless you count Clown College as college, which Steve-O actually went to. Okay, so there's all these instances in which they mark themselves as lower status, they identify themselves as lower class, and in which they position themselves as kind of against the environmentalist authority, the environmentalist elite. And I think that there's a genuine skepticism that you see going on here. I'm just going to give you a different image to look at. I think there's a genuine skepticism, but I also want to stress the role of performance in the program. So obviously these guys are not 16-year-old skateboarders, right? Presumably they don't live in a trailer park. I don't even know if they like monster truck rallies. But for whatever reason, there's something going on here in terms of how they're positioning themselves that tells us about the typical audience, both for nature and wildlife programming and for environmentalist campaigns. So they're positioning themselves as outside of that audience, apart from that audience, as unable to relate to a certain environmental or environmentalist status quo. Okay. So I think that gives you, hopefully, some relevant context or background to understand how that fits into my project, sort of the angles that I'm taking on this. And I want to spend the rest of my talk today talking about two specific aspects of the program and working through their implications. So the first aspect is their irreverent approach to animals in landscape, and the second is their interest in animal and human sexuality. Okay. So I'll talk about irreverence in two different ways. The first is in terms of affect. I should explain, affect is this very, as many of you know, it's a buzzword, buzzy right now, especially in animal studies, in a lot of areas in the humanities. When I say affect, what I mean is the ways in which responses are calculated toward the non-human. So when the Wild Boys encounter a non-human animal, when they encounter a landscape feature, what's the emotional or non-emotional response that's happening there, right? What's kind of the attitude, or what's the connection that's going on there? So in terms of affect, they are they don't respond with awe or wonder to animals in landscape. So they make fun of animals' lack of prowess instead of praising or being amazed by their capabilities or their special qualities. So for instance, at one point, I think they're back in Florida, and they're looking at these baby sea turtles on the beach, and they film it with a night vision camera. And Chris Pontius says, I'm going to read this quote, we have to film this with our special night vision cameras so as not to disorient the turtles. They get confused very easily. Some would call them idiots. At another point, they describe, or at multiple points, they describe animals as ugly. So Steve-O asks if it's dangerous to make out with a batfish, and their sidekick says, no, but it's got a face like a toad. It's actually kind of cute. I mean, it's ugly, but it's cute in its ugliness. So, this kind of affective response extends to landscape, not just to animals. They act uninterested in learning anything about their environs and display no sense of wonder or awe about natural phenomenon. So when they get to Australia, they introduce the episode by saying, the Great Barrier Reef, so much to see, so little to learn. I think there's also a formal manifestation, not just an affective manifestation of this irreverence. You see it, for instance, in how short the segments are. So they'll spend very little time on a particular animal or landscape feature, sometimes 10 seconds or less. So they're not encouraging that kind of contemplation or appreciation, contemplative appreciation of the non-human and of the natural that environmentalist campaigns so often rely on. They also tend to feature the interruption shot. I need a better term for this, so if you have a suggestion, let me know. So we'll see these really idyllic panoramic shots of animals or landscape, a group of ostriches, for example, the New Zealand mountains, and then the wild boys will streak in front of the camera not wearing pants and just kind of interrupt your appreciation, or what seems to be your appreciation of the beauty. Okay, so what are the implications here? I think some of these are kind of obvious, but there's some kind of mocking of environmentalist didacticism going on. They regularly ask each other, so what have we learned today? And then they'll say, like, nothing. Or we learned hyenas are really good at football or something stupid. So it's a really kind of like anti-didactic. They're insisting that they haven't learned anything and that you haven't learned anything either. And again, this is a performance. So you do learn things. I learn things, such as the batfish is ugly but cute. So they're teaching you things, but not in a teacherly manner, right? It's just a completely different approach. Kind of relatedly, I think they're speaking critically to that knowledge deficit hypothesis that I talked about before, which other scholars have identified as not just misguided, but patronizing. So again, this idea, if you only understood habitat destruction, you would do something about it. If you only got how climate change worked, you would do something about it. So this idea that environmentalists and or environmental experts, they're the ones that get it, and that getting it is what matters. That's the idea I think they're working against. Again, this might be a little obvious, but I'm seeing them as questioning the sentimental environmentalist idea that you have to love something or act lovingly toward it to care about its fate. Okay, so that was number one, irreverence. Number two is animal and human sexuality. I just realized that that's not animal and vegetable drag, that's animal and fruit drag, but hopefully you will bear with that. So they dress up like animals, they dress up like food, and I can talk about this maybe later, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So on the left you can see that, you know, the zebra, their really terrible rendition of a zebra is good enough for those lions, I guess. Good enough for them, worked for them, so they're going to attack it. On the right, the bananas don't work, so there's gorillas back there. I don't know if you can see, but the gorillas just kind of sit there. Okay, so like I said, I can discuss this further. I think whether these performances fail or don't fail, I think there's something really interesting going on with the kind of vision that it's offering you, or the kind of vision it's asking you to think about. So actually I want to go back real quick. Sorry. So this picture in particular, I don't know how well you guys can see it in the back. I'm really fascinated by it because at first it seems funny because you think like the bear doesn't get it, right? The bear doesn't get that that's not really a white gorilla or whatever it is. But then it's all about the animal looking rather than looking at the animal, right? So there's a different sort of thing about watching that's happening here. And there's so many possibilities. And basically we have to admit, I don't know what it sees, right? I don't know if it's convinced, not convinced, if it matters that it's convinced or not. So there's something interesting going on with watching and drag that I'll have to figure out later. But okay. Okay. I'm using the term drag that I'm sure you're all familiar with in terms of gender studies. I just want to do a quick Judith Butler 101 gender drag thing. Okay, so Judith Butler, famous gender theorist, her argument is that drag is not an attempt to fool, but it's an attempt to, it's a practice that draws attention to the constructed binary of male-female and to masculinity and femininity as performances. So here, I think it's clear they're not really trying to fool anyone, or if they are trying, they're failing. But inadvertently or not, they're drawing attention to the human, non-human binary and to humanness as a kind of performance that marks us off as not animal. We also have pretty explicitly sexualized encounters with animals. I forget what was happening here. I think, well, I know what's happening here, but I think this is an outtake because they were part of the same costume. So one of them was the back of, I guess it's supposed to be a sheep, right? One of them was the back and one of them was the front. And when the animal starts humping on them, the other one runs away. So that's why he doesn't have a front. Okay, anyway. So they encourage or allow animals to hump them. They kiss or make out with animals. They make verbal and visual comparisons. So when they meet I think it's actually called the barebutt baboon. I mean, it's not like the Latinate name, but that's the English language name. Steve-O looks at it and says, "I thought I had an ugly wiener," which unfortunately for German speakers means penis in English. I'm sorry. Okay. And then at one point they meet a reindeer. Oh, sorry, I should read this last part. They refer to the animal as sexually attractive, the human as sexually attractive to the animal, or vice versa, especially in a queer sense. So when they meet a reindeer, they look at his genitalia, and Chris Pontius says, "I would hate to be around that guy at mating season. He would tear me apart." Okay. So, wrapping up, the last sort of sub-aspect of this aspect is their general obsession. At this point, you've probably figured this out, that they are obsessed with the obscene and the revolting. You have lots of images of animal and human genitalia. You have animals and humans defecating, urinating, vomiting, etc. And I guess that's it. That's enough. That's enough revolting and obscene things. What are the implications? The first thing that sticks out to me, of course, is that it tells us that there's plenty that's unnatural and queer about non-human nature. So they're not, the non-human in the program is not tasked with representing, let's say, heterosexual family values, like you see in so many other environmentalist texts. So if you think of March of the Penguins, for instance, that film was famously embraced by the Christian right in the United States because supposedly it's put forth, the importance of the nuclear family, the heterosexual nuclear family. So in Wild Boys, animals are not being tasked with that, those kinds of goals or those kinds of purposes. Cynthia Chris talks about this as well, but it's obviously important that the interest in animal and human sexuality that the program showcases highlights the blurry line between the human and the non-human. So there's more of a focus on the things that make humans animals than on the things that make them not animals. So everyone on the show, regardless of species, is acting sexual. Everyone is eating, digesting, sleeping, vomiting, whatever. It doesn't matter if you're human or not human. Everyone's doing it on this program. This I have not worked out yet, so I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. But I can only call an image like this masochistic, right? The posture, everything about it, everything that they do on the show is all about sort of availing their bodies to dangerous, painful experiences, right? And the literal sort of hands-off approach, like I'm just letting it happen to me, right? So I'm trying to think, this might be too simplistic, and I'm making it a binary, but the program certainly raises the question of what a masochistic rather than sadistic, which we might say is the norm, approach to the non-human might look like. To what ends might it function? Why is it important that we see the wild boys acting masochistically, whether it's a performance or not? What does that mean? Okay, just got a couple more slides. I have to bring in Mel Chen here. There's a fabulous book that came out, I think, last year called Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Mattering, and Queer Affect. So you've got your affect term there again. Chen points out or argues that animal-human boundaries are articulated in terms of sex and gender, and human substantiation enduringly depends on the expulsion of animals. Thus, it is imperative that we ask questions not only about how animals matter, but how they matter sexually. And this is the kind of perfect overlap with Wild Boys. Chen notes the odd yet pervasive omission in cultural animal representations, which is the genitalia, and suggests that such a phenomenon could, instead of being seen as a trivial or expected circumstance, right, like you don't want to have a children's cartoon where the baboon has a penis, that would be traumatic, but that's kind of the obvious reading. So the argument is not that, it's a matter of censorship, it's a matter of propriety, but it's actually part of the cultural production of animals. We have to absent the genitalia in order for the animal to be different from us. So, in its irreverent and flippant way, I'm going to argue that Wild Boys recognizes this idea, recognizes that animals matter sexually. Specifically, in making animal genitalia overwhelmingly present, the Wild Boys trouble a central cultural process by which animals are produced as different and, of course, as lower than humans. Okay. We're almost there, almost at the end. The large conclusion, what's the big payoff? I think I've been working towards this. The program challenges some of our most dearly held beliefs about environment and environmentalism in three specific ways, including that reverence is essential for investment in the non-human, that public knowledge is the missing piece in environmentalist struggles, and that the admirable, aesthetically pleasing, and heteronormative qualities of nature and animals are the strongest basis for arguments on their behalf. And that is it.